So, Asatruar today. Asatruar embraces a polytheistic worldview. It venerates, as they say, deities, even though if you're to study them, they in fact actually worship them. The key three deities are the Odin and Thor and Freya. The movement expanded globally. It prevailed, as I said, in North America. The practices, of course, as it got to America, begin to vary drastically, and that's owed to the Protestant background of the United States. And I simply mean that compared to Catholicism that focuses on a singular identity, unity, you have Protestantism about individual interpretation, about private practice of belief. So whereas you could argue Asatruar had a little bit more of a Catholic take when it was in Europe, it took a definitively Protestant approach when it hit the Americas. It begins to focus more and more on individual practice, individual growth, individual application of Asatruar. So it's now disjointed and seeks itself. It's theology. So this is an Odinist worship ritual sacrifice going on in the Temple of Gaut, Spain. These are not costumes, these are not practices, this is not a reenactment, but these are genuine, sincere beliefs in these pagan sacrifices that they're committing. So that's an Odinist priest right there. As I said before, Odin, Thor, and Freya are the main three gods, but though not what we would say in Norse paganism or even in a Norse mythology book for children, these are the ones that they establish more or less as the Aesir, which we might call in Greek mythology the pantheon, the main gods. And so there are 11 that are broken up into the Aesir, the Vanir, primarily Odin, Thor, Frigg, Baldur, Tyr, Heimdall. And if you notice, all of these are the names of characters within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You have the Vanir, which are the gods of fertility and prosperity, Njord, Freya, Freyr. Of course, Loki always taking a neutral stance, which is really a chaotic stance. He seeks to interrupt. And then you have the Jotun, which is, of course, Norse for giant, because in the Norse mythology, the gods are ever waging war against the Jotunheim, the giants, which at the end of time, Ragnarok, they'll hopefully conquer. And so you have Skadi within them. But as honorable mention, there's also some minor gods, Bor, Bragi, Hermod, Hod, Hel, Vidar, Vale, Forseti, Mimir, Ulir, Eden. Again, where you see the Protestantization go on more than even in Europe, even though it is there, you pick from these gods. You pick and choose from these gods. And the Asatruar I talked with, no two of them had the same set of gods. Some pick one god, some pick the other one god. Some bundle some gods together. It's a pick 2 for 3 deal, apparently. But the idea, again, there is no coherence to a unified religion in any way. It's according to your taste, according to your individual pursuit. So then ceremonies, we have the bloat, which is the ritual sacrifice to the gods. Animal is sacrificed, cooked, and eaten at a feast after the bloat. Now, that's the current practice. The ancient practice actually was also to have human sacrifice. Now it's mostly symbolic. Within the U.S. prison system, you are allowed one animal-shaped cracker as your ritualist sacrifice within the, kid you not. Like, I actually checked with a prison warden on that one. He told me I wasn't wrong. All right. But that could even still be more sincere, because had they been able to seek something more substantial, they would. The average student, especially in college, which is starting to become more and more Asatruar, instead opts for homemade beer, wine, mead. So you see, again, there's not even a committal to whatever the religion it is. They pick the softer end. They still can't help but stay close to their originally Christian roots. They don't even have the stomach, as some of them, for the Asatruar practice. You have symbols. The ritualized celebration, it occurs in 3 rounds. First, you toast the gods, then you toast your ancestors, then you open it up for boast, oaths, roast, stories, songs, poems, so basically a college frat party, all right, but to the gods. Now, the other thing is the stali, which is what would be the equivalent of the Asatruar altar. Now, it can come in two forms as it can with the Catholic. They have the community altar, and they also can have the home altar. So it can either be private or it can be communal. You have the, and of course, stele just means shrine within the Old Norse. It's used for rituals, it's used for offerings, it's used for divination, trying to read the signs of the gods. You have the main altar, which in this case is generic for the sake of this image, but typically one would put as the altar cloth your family's clan, your family's markings underneath. You'd have idols and images. You can see one over there that's towards Odin on the far left. You'd see offering bowls for food, drink being offered to the gods. Of course, candles and lighting, very similar to the same thing within Christianity. So perhaps the most benevolent part of the altar is simply to create the sacred atmosphere. Again, certain things are consonant with all religions. Symbols and runes, you see on the far side, they have a bowl of their own private runes, which is at its basis the alphabet of the Viking. J.R.R. Tolkien even used those in the historic academic sense, but theirs they would not just leave to the alphabet, they would compose those shapes together in a certain shape that would have certain rune spells or certain divinations that they wish to perform. Incense or smudging tools where they burn, ritual tools, sacred text or books. And of course decorations according to their liturgical season. One of the more interesting things you'll see within them is something called hammer casting. So hammer casting is named after Mjolnir, which is Thor's hammer. It's used for divination. They would throw the hammer and cast it onto the table or onto the ground. And much like reading the tea leaves or the birds with augury, they would read the way and the shape in which the hammer fell. So for them, which direction, cardinal, north, south, east, west, or any variation in between, would mean one thing. They would have runes painted, carved, burned onto the hammer. So the way the hammer fell, much like the rolling of a dice, would determine what something meant. So they have their, the liturgical calendar. So, and I only say liturgical in the sense that it is a religious season. That's not meant to misappropriate. Liturgical actually isn't a specifically Catholic term, but we know it that way. Liturgy simply meaning the way religious ceremonies go about and the seasons by which it goes about. And so because the Catholic Church matches or has the calendar set around specific seasons, we determine Easter by the first full moon after the spring equinox. In a lot of ways, our calendar does line up with them. But as Chesterton again would say, that's common to all man. Some things are just common to all religions and faiths. Most cultures would begin to shape their seasons around the seasons. And so the Norse pagan, the neo-pagan, the Asatruar would try to claim that because any given one of these lines up with a religious feast day, that somehow we're the same. That somehow they're equivalent and they're just two different shades of the same color. Yes, Christmas. So some of the things they try to claim is because there's December 21st is Yule, it's also Christmas. Well, no, it's because it's the winter solstice. All right, we have Imbolc, which is on February 1st. They say we put St. Bridget there because it's when spring begins. Even if we did, it doesn't matter. Ostara, which we have for Easter. Well, yes, as we said, that's supposed to be the first full moon after the spring equinox. And so on and so forth. Another popular one right now. But Samhain, which is basically the new year, the new harvest, is a religious festival for them. And so they claim, that we simply tried to Christianize or baptize Halloween. Now, my answer is, what's wrong with that? If we're evangelizing and baptizing the world, we shouldn't have shame. But at the same time, we didn't baptize that holiday. We have our seasons mapped, our feast mapped to those seasons. As a way of note before we move forward, of this calendar, the four that are most important to the Norse pagans, March 20th, June 21st, September 21st, and December 21st. And the key to all of those is basically they have something to do with Odin, for the most part. Now, they also can deal with Freya secondarily, and Baldur, but all have a connection to Odin in some way. Of the 7 that are on here, 4 are Odinic or very Odin-based. So that was their theology. What are some of their philosophies boiled down from all of this? Well, first, they're folkist. What does folkist mean? It means, and then for the sake of this, an ism is a bad thing. I know somebody would say Catholicism, but we can get to that later. An ism is making the devil out of a thing, as C.S. Lewis would say. It's making something an absolute. And so that's actually the irony with Catholicism. As John Senior would say, it's making an absolute of Catholicos, everything. So the very word Catholic actually neutralizes the idea of making the devil out of something. So folkism is making an absolute of your folk, of your ethnicity, of the people you come from. It's taking a good thing, love of people, and it's turning it into a bad thing. Utter blinding devotion to a people. And so one's blood and ancestral heritage is everything to that people, to a religious level. But it's more interesting with the Norse, with the Asatruar. It's not just that devotion. They believe that they are created from their gods in the image of their gods. That's not dissimilar from us. But they also believe they're created in the image of their kin. And I don't simply mean that we come from our parents, but then in a godlike way, they're shaped and sculpted from their kin. So the Northern European folks are said to be descended from Odin, the chief of the gods. Again, you saw that with Elsa Christensen. They're descended from the gods themselves. Well, specifically with Asatruar, they believe they're descended from Odin. So if you're not descended from Odin, you're not Asatruar. And that causes a problem even within their faith, because you have lots of people coming into this belief that are not descended from Odin, supposedly. So you have people being brought in, attracted to this faith, that could never hope to actually become a pure member of this faith. So genetics and continuing the family line are of the utmost importance. You have naturism. And again, yes, I know we could say pantheism, but I wanted to use this specifically. Seeing nature as not just a living entity, but one to be revered as Mother Earth instead of as Sister Earth, as St. Francis might say. They believed that nature spirits lived in the woods, the rocks, and the enchanted groves. And so the whole universe was seen as this living tree. So for the third time in this presentation, we get Yggdrasil, the world tree. So that's the reason for this image. We see the tree in every religion, including Christianity, but here the tree is worshipped. Here the tree is everything. We see shamanism. And so if you have worshipers of nature, you have to have someone interpret that nature for you. Now, you have those who practice or interact with nature and the goddess Freya, with the Sed. You also have the Vulvas or Seer workers, seers who engage in magical and divine practices or divination. And so the modern Asatruar don't just keep it to the shaman, they appoint themselves the shaman as well in their own house, in their own community. So again, we have this Protestant nature of the shift of focus from authority. They make themselves their own authority. And so I will say as preface here with many of the Asatruar I talked with, this one is split down the middle. Half of them claim him, half of them deny him. But if you don't know who this was the main stormer of the Capitol in the January 6th storming. And so he is a self-described shaman of the time. Now, half of them don't want to claim him because they consider him to be a far-right extremist and racist. I don't know about racist, but I think we can call him an extremist here. It's not how I walk out of the house. Now, the next aspect, paganism. Paganism, of course, coming from the Latin, simply meaning those who live in the country. So the pagans were the last people to ever become Christian when the church was coming through Europe Christianizing. Sometimes they never converted. So in pockets of country folk who never received the faith. It can also, in a more broad sense, mean, or narrow sense, mean any non-Christian Judaic Islamic faith tradition or religion. And that's not an acceptance of Islam, but at least what is claimed that they worship the same Abrahamic God. So paganism would be anything outside of that, especially polytheism. But what could be said about paganism is that it at least attempts to worship God, however schizophrenic the attempt is, multiplying God from one to many. And you could claim that those within Asatruar that are doing so are trying to get back to their ancestral practices again, however wrong that may be. But perhaps other than the folkism, the more troubling aspect of Asatruar is the occult. We've talked about it several times now. In short, the occult is trying to take God's powers from him when he won't do what you want him to do. All right, that's the very Mr. Summers shorthand of it. But longer, it's the interference in the natural course of things using secret knowledge. It's the manipulation of reality. In various texts I've read, it's been called the despair of God. It's been called the ruin of empires. It's even been called the disease of religion according to pagan religions, because the pagan seeks at least a god, if the wrong god, but they don't seek themselves. They seek someone out of and above themselves. Whereas the occult despairs of God's providence. They despair of him coming in and giving them what they want and thinking they know what they need for their own life. And when they don't get that, they engage in very intricate, very historic, as old as time practices to try to crack the God code. Try to get at the heart of things and use those things for themselves. And a word, spells. I mean, these are what spells are. They're the belief that God's just using a set of codes himself, and you could get at those codes yourself as well through a long, arduous process. Like I said, it's the ruin of a disease of religion, but it's also the ruin of empires. One of the last things I discovered in my own research was that it was actually the fall of non-Christian empires. Babylon fell as there was a rise in occultist practices towards the end of its empire. You had the Maku series, you had the cult of Marduk, you had, with Greece, you had the Eleusinian mysteries, you had curse tablets, you had magical papyri, you had within Rome, Hermeticism become prevalent. Again, astrology starts to gain. You see Neoplatonism, you see the cult of Isis. So Babylonian, Greek, Roman, as the empire grew, the magical practices grew to supposedly keep that empire. And as those magical practices grew, the empire became sicker and sicker until it crumbled. So yes, we could argue that's a correlation. But it is a phenomenal observation, meaning you can see it happen over large amounts of time to large empires, and the same thing always happens.